Hello. I'm streaming. Here, bear with me while I sort some of my stuff out. This is not good, nor is it sorted out. I'm off on a bad, slow start today, so I'll do my best. I'm feeling better. This is just on top of me at the moment. Firstly, let's put our chat up on screen. This is something that I like to do. And let's move it around. Move this over so I can't see myself. And move that over so that I can kind of see it. Hey, I got a chat. And I think my levels are reasonably okay. Actually, I can pump that a little bit. I think my levels are going to be fine. And you know what? I made myself some chai tea and didn't have time to finish making it. So I'll show you that. And I haven't clipped this on in my robe because I'm setting up all of the stuff. That's just how that's going. And here's my lovely chai. It's actually probably still too hot and hasn't steeped enough, so maybe I'll just chill for a minute, waiting for it to be done. How does this go? Let's try clipping this on like this. I'm only going to be taking it back off again. Alrighty, and I need to figure out a better thing to do with my power cable. This is dumb. I have my camera powered by this, and it's plugged in over there, so it's like dangling and just begging to be tripped over. Whatever, I'm here. And I got some things to talk. Am I focused right? Now I am. I think I am. I'm actually going to be putting almond creamer in the chai. And I'm exploring places where I can get stuff like oat creamer, because almond creamer is tasty enough, but it uses too much water. So although I like it, I don't like it, if you know what I mean. And I can probably, if I can find my way to the thing, Q&A question, I believe I can update the Q&A question. And that will be shown, updated. And chai is CHAI. But yeah, I mean, I like the almond creamer. I have not been getting milk and cream for some time. I just don't like how almond cultivation uses up stupid amounts of water. It's like one of those things where you can make an argument for like going vegetarian on the basis of just how inefficient stuff like red meat actually is. And almonds are kind of like that. Almonds are not a nice crop to have. So yeah, and I hope my folks don't have coronavirus. That's the thing is, anything that is happening in the world can be abused by people who are trying to cause panic and harm the people in the nation states that they don't like. And there's so much of that going around, especially since like we're having a primary election here in the United States, that things are just a little bonkers. So I would say like do not panic about things, and be wary of when you're being fed information that is inclined to make you panic, because the people who are doing that might not have your best interests at heart. I feel pleased that I'm getting over the nasty fit of sickness that I had without it doing me too much damage, because it stuck around in my lungs for a while and then sort of backed off, and it's not as bad as it was. So there's that. So hey, welcome to, oh, and I can get down into the camera range there. There's a lot of things that I could change if I was able to update the system a little bit. For instance, if I could raise this camera and light rig, I would do that, but I can't do that right now. Maybe I can get a shim of some kind. And I've just put out API clips, and that I feel went pretty well. And I dropped a hint that me and my brother got together this last Sunday, and we did a little work on a video game that he's working on. He had this idea where he wanted to start doing a game in like sort of predictable, familiar ways for him, but when he does those and finishes them all the way through, he doesn't then like them because he already knew what that game was. That's why he did it. He's looking for stuff that is novel and interesting, and you dare say creative, but which is not so familiar to him that he finds it boring. So we're working on stuff that way. And I've also got a game that I'm still kind of trying to find whether I can think of anything sound-wise for it. You'd think that I'd be good at that, but no, I'm not. But I do have a game that I'll be putting out at some point. It'll be taken like the Sunday release period, and patrons will hear about it, and people who follow what I'm doing will hear about it, but it won't go on the plugin forums because it's not a plugin. And yeah, my brother is doing good. He's been recovering well from like the strokes and stuff, and I'm pleased about that. And one of the things that we did was I told him, hey, I could use help doing a particular thing because there's a bunch of people who would like to see me doing GUI plugins. And I've done stuff like that before, like in my response to the API Calypse post on Gear Sluts. And I wouldn't be surprised if a bunch of people jumped on that. I posted a little more about what me and Dan were talking about, and a screenshot of the old Mastering Tools plugin that I did. And that is a graphical user interface that I made and ended up fairly pleased with. I wonder how long my tea is going to take to make. It's probably about done. It's been, what? Oh goodness, like maybe 10 minutes or so. I think my tea is done. So here, what I'm going to say is I got a bunch of things to talk about and a bunch of stuff to do. I have lists of plugins to put into various kits, and so I'm still getting together that kind of thing. I've been making notes on what I'm calling all music experience modality, and I'm thinking in terms of different kinds of music and sort of the philosophy of it. So I've got that I can talk about a little bit as well. And I have more paper and a brand spanking new pen because the other one was running out. So I can make notes on paper in such a way that you can actually see them, but I also need to go and put creamer into my chai and a little stevia. So I'll be back in a moment. By all means, ask questions. I will try to answer them when I get back. Yep. Hey, that's weird. Here, Airwindows samples, fresh for the taking. Oh, guess it stopped doing it. Hey, I'm back. Let me adjust my microphone and stuff. There we go. So yeah, here we are. I'm going to go to like 12:37 or 12:40 or something like that. And then I'm probably going to take a nap. I feel like I'm still kind of recuperating because I'm old and I don't bounce back from things the way that I might if I was a lot younger. So well, whatever. Let me glance over the chat and stuff. And yeah, I've got one short question, which I will call those things first. After all, what I've got up on my screen right now is Q&A question Monday. You're working on mixes with the channel and bus combinations. Are you good using different versions as long as you decode before running to the next? That's absolutely something that you can do. Although remember, all that you're over 50. All that you're doing, if you mix and match that stuff, is make it not work right. And people can do that on purpose if they want. Like if you put in a encode that saturated more sharply, what you would just get is a overall effect that was more saturated. The encode saturated stuff and then the decode desaturates stuff and makes it sort of more spiky and dynamic. It's more like a compressor expander type thing, except for there's no time constant. So there's nothing actually stopping you from mismatching stuff in every way. Now, with regard to the ones that are designed to be completely lossless, because they are designed to be completely lossless. I feel like I'm a little bit loud here. So, that'll do. The ones that are designed to be completely lossless, yes, you can put one in one summing situation and then come out of that and go into another one that's different but also lossless, and it would all end up being lossless. And that is the case for certainly console 5 and 6, because they're mathematically lossless in that way. If you have only one thing going into them, then you get exactly that out. And I haven't made any further ones. 5 is the sort of density-based one, and then 6 is another fellow who donated the algorithm because he just sort of came up with it on some charting application or other and was like, this looks like it would be an encode-decode pair. And he was right. It just kicks in distortion easier. So the ones that are lossless, yes, you can mix and match them any way you want. So yeah, it feels weird being set down this low. Let me scooch up a little bit. There we go. It's all good. Hey, the top of my head is still showing, and I can just barely avoid cropping it off the top of the screen. It's all good. So yeah, me and Dan were talking about getting into VST GUI making, and the thing about that is he kind of figured out why it was that I couldn't understand it. It's very C++ oriented, and I have no training in C++, and the stuff that I write is pretty strictly C style, and because it's low-level audio code, and I think that's appropriate. And not only is the VST GUI code C++, but it's also C++ with multiple inheritance. So basically he was like, yeah, I can see why you didn't get any of this. That would be completely baffling to you because it's a whole level of sort of advanced object-oriented stuff that's kind of gone out of fashion. He described it as sort of late 80s late 80s C++ concepts that are no longer considered good. But he understands them because he went to, school extensively for computer science and stuff. And this is why I think some of his coding, like he's a really interesting perspective for me to have. Because he'll do things that seem to me to be completely horrible, and yet sometimes they work better than I would have imagined. Like doing this game, and he'll be doing a frame by frame thing where he's asking the game engine, which is the Godot engine, to dig through all of its nodes and identify certain classes of them in order to do something with those. And he's doing that literally every frame in this incredibly inefficient way. And I'm like, wow, that's going to fall over and die. You're doing it the most inefficient way imaginable. And he's like, well, I don't care, I'm doing it anyway. And we'll run the thing, and it'll actually not crash and die immediately. Although when it's really heinous, he'll do a couple of things, and then the program will start to chug because what he's asked it to do is so dumb. And it's very interesting to see what the programs can do with this like object-oriented or incredibly inefficient ways of doing things. Old C++ is never CPU efficient. C tends to be CPU efficient if you do it right. C++ is still more CPU efficient than some things, but it's like a chainsaw with blades for handles. It's terrible. And you can write it in such a way that it does very efficient things by just skipping some of the features. Or it's like, honestly, if I think about it, yeah, it kind of is, even with the elaborate inheritance stuff, fairly CPU efficient because there's really nothing there to protect you from the consequences of your own choices. So, like C++ is in practice still mostly C, which is the next thing up from assembly language. It's very efficient indeed. And what gets you into trouble is you start making, it's not that it's not CPU efficient, it's a conceptual morass. It's a complete mess, and it's really unapproachable. It's one of those things where it's like, yeah, you have to be this incredible nerd who took this in school for many, many years. And then even, once you've done that, you're writing code that might be just like, well, it's not all that efficient, and nobody else can understand it. And it's just this pile of abstractions. So Elohim has asked a question, so I'll jump on that immediately. Am I planning on using vector graphics? Probably not. And the reason I'm probably not expecting to use vector graphics is because I'm probably going to be coding stuff from basically like raw primitives. Because sometimes you can do that. Like our experience with the game programming was kind of neat because we had this concept of a sort of Galaxian-like game, but with a notion of you were on a moving piece of paper and busting holes in the paper, which then enemies could fall into, but then you might fall into too. And visiting my sister a little while ago, previous weekend, we threw out that whole mechanic in some ways and came up with a different one, which was you're firing stuff, and the stuff that you're firing slits holes in the paper, and then if they cross each other, you could fall through the bits where the slices crossed. So you're generating obstacles for yourself by firing these shots, and and then you get to move around a little bit more. So, I see. I was talking about that because of the mention of vector graphics. Dan was a little intimidated by that because he was like, oh, there's so much trig going on in that. And I was like, yep, there will be. And I figured I was going to be able to figure it out because I would be able to sort of wing it or like look up some basic things and then make it work. Turns out the Godot engine, and maybe one day I'll do live streams where we program stuff together in the Godot engine and like chat thinks of stuff and then I explain how it's done. That would be fun. But in the Godot engine, they give you routines for that stuff. You know, it's like they'll give you stuff like, you know, intersection of line segment and line segment returns a vector 2D that is the location of the intersection. And I'm like, cool. And there was stuff like intersect, you know, give you the angle of something and something else. And so I was off and running. I was like, well, that makes it easy. They just gave us everything that we need. Here, type this in and type that in. And we started getting the intersecting lines thing going. And it was like, well, how are you going to, I don't know how we're going to get this angle thing. And I was like, oh, that is very simple. This angle minus this angle. And of course, it worked. Because it was one of those things where it's like, this is the general thing, and I'm going to fool with it. And if it looks like it's the opposite of what is needing to happen, I'll make it negative. And if it looks like it's twice as much, I'll make it half as much. And I'll just sort of try to get a visual sense of what the thing is doing by trying it. And I had Dan doing that kind of stuff too. He wanted to start doing it because he saw it working for me, and he never used to do that before. He always had to work stuff out from first principles. So it was a fun day. It was a fun thing with that. Now, when I bring that up, I'm talking about firing up the VST GUI libraries because all the VSTs I've made have had this sitting there in the libraries the whole time. They have had the capacity to like run the same compile, include some other things about like what they call an editor, which is so normal that everybody basically does that. I'm just not. And it will include things like, you know, this is a bitmap. You include a bitmap, it has to be a Windows BMP. And a bunch of stuff where it's like, this is how this is done. And they give you like, basically they're giving you the sliders over again, but you get to specify what the picture of the slider looks like and the track of the slider and a bunch of stuff that's kind of tacky. But what I need, give me the drawing operations for that little bit of screen. Like, I get it that you can draw a bitmap and that it lets you put a bitmap down on it. I get that it lets you put a picture down. But what I'm asking is, what do they make available as far as like, can I draw a circle? I know I can draw a text because I've seen that. We were only able to find a little bit of example code, and mostly not even that. And mostly people are using toolkits, and people are making other libraries for making it easier because what was supplied was not sophisticated. But you know me, I'm not looking for sophisticated. I'm looking for, can I draw a circle on this screen in such a way that it updates, that it works. Once I start playing with it, I don't think it's going to be resizable because I don't think that stuff comes that way. So I'll have to design it and have my own style of what the GUIs look like. And because resizable becomes a whole other story. We will see whether that becomes even possible. I do not know. But the story about vectors is vectors are not included in this library. And vectors are not necessarily what I'll need, because to do the displays, like the stuff that was in mastering tools and blinky lights for things, people have always wanted blinky lights for like if you're distorting or clipping or compressing or whatever. And given a GUI interface, I can absolutely do that. I'll be doing it in my way. I'll be figuring out some useful and interesting way for doing it, like changing colors and stuff that's cool and creative. But I'll be working from a framework where you're basically given a little size, which is the editor size, and I'll need enough primitives that I can draw things on there with basically draw tools. And it's going to be that. I may or may not need to use like bitmaps. I may or may not be able to do stuff like include resource files where people can punch in their own colors for things. It depends, because it all has to fit in the basic category of old school VST GUI that'll run on anything. And even that is sketchy, but I bet I can do stuff in a primitive enough way that it'll be adaptable to basically everything by just using. And even then, it's like I can use all of the VST GUI techniques for things. I will not necessarily be able to offer 100, 150% of it. I may not be able to offer anything. Anything. It'll depend. We'll see. But I'm shooting for stuff like that. I'm looking for a functional, yeah, Stephen K. So that's where that stands. Basically what's going to happen is Dan's going to come out sometime this coming month, and in the process of doing the game coding thing that we're doing, we're going to dig into the SDK because I have the SDK. And Dan knows how to look in. What he needs to do is look in the code of the actual library. It's written in C++. So if I do that, it won't tell me anything. Here, let me keep goosing my volume or figuring out what I need for volume. So I can look in that and I won't know anything. And I've already done that and got nowhere because I don't speak C++. I don't understand what they're doing. Dan does. So what he needs to do is look in the actual code of the libraries that we're compiling against, and he'll track them down and he'll look for whatever keywords show up, and I'll watch what he's doing because I want to learn how to do that too. Like, just as he is learning how to experiment and be more creative from watching me do it, I'm going to try to learn how he does that stuff, because he went to school for that. I did not. I have autism and dropped out of school and was having a really weird time. So that set the course for my life, basically. And I can't say as I'm particularly sorry, but I sure didn't get a computer science education. It's kind of just as well, because when I start doing something, I am always thinking of what is the thing that I'm trying to do, and only then am I looking for how can I make this program do it. And Dan, through his computer science training, looks at a compiler or something like that, or a game engine like Godot, and goes, what am I supposed to do with this set of tools? What do the set of tools want to do? And you do that and you wind up doing things like the demo programs that the developers did over again. And that's never my concern. I'm never interested in like, well, how do I do the thing that this library wants me to do? Instead, it's like, what am I trying? Well, it's not that it dumbs people down, but he's being taught to use a set of frameworks and to be able to orient himself to the new frameworks as they're coming in. And as a result, he's the ideal ally for digging into stuff like this. But I'm Chris from Airwindows, and I've made my living for like 10 years being able to do stuff that people like that don't think of. So it's a neat little partnership that way. And it's not a partnership in a formal way. Maybe in general, I don't know. I just feel I didn't adapt to school very well. So one of the things I was thinking about that I might as well bring up as long as we're talking and stuff. We've got about an hour ago. Is and you can shoot off questions anytime you want, and I will answer them. I think Bo was asking about what's messy with vectors, and all I was saying in response was the VST GUI will not give me vectors by default. And I won't necessarily need to use them because I don't need to necessarily use vector curves so much as just primitives like circles and circles and text and marks on the screen and stuff like that. If I can do that, I can do what I did with the mastering tools. Just some basic drawing primitives, and the stuff that I would do would be based along those lines. But I was also bringing this up. So this is what I was coming up with as far as just trying to break down what exists in the concept of music in general. Interestingly, I'm drinking less coffee than I was. I've been going through some changes and getting sick is part of that, but I'm also following this like recovery process that has me going through a thing that we call a 4th and 5th step. And those are sort of taking inventory of who you are and where you're at. And it has led me to be kind of lower. I'm feeling less bound by duty, less driven, and more just wanting to explore and experiment, which I think is going to work out good for me. Here's one of the results that I just held up for you. So all music experience modality. The first thing that came to mind was density versus sparsity in terms of raw sound versus silence. Like there are genres, for instance, metal, where a lot of the stuff that you might do, or here's another one, dubstep. A lot of the stuff that you do, much of the time is going to be filled up with incredibly dense, high amplitude sound. There's not a lot of space in there. By contrast, you can have stuff like trip hop, where the it's mostly carved out of silence. It's mostly silence and reverb and space, and the sounds that hit could be full loudness, but they're not going to take up the full frequency range. They're not going to take up the full amplitude range. So that's a very general concept of density versus sparsity, and that's one way that music can be different from other music. Then you got repetitiveness. And I also see that, like I said, EDM to raw meltdown, also the consistency of repetition. Because the music jams that I do, I'm sort of carving out a space with those and figuring out where I want it to be. And I've been desperate to get some key changes and chord changes and things in there. I wanted to start coming up with novelty that's consistent rather than just randomness. And so I worked really hard on that to the point where it's beginning to work. It's beginning to give me results. And that violates repetitiveness, but the general concept, the general genre that I'm working in is still a very repetitive one. It's EDM. I'm using like techno-style music, and I'm fascinated by techno music, which can be characterized by repetitive beats and structured sounds that are also deeply repetitive. Like you can have 4-beat or 8-beat repetitions. Maybe a max that you might see is 16-beat repetitions. But if you've got 16th notes going on, like in techno, you might very easily have a 4-beat loop that's making abstract sounds, but it's just cycling, and it's like the same thing. It's not necessarily, because there's a hypnotic effect, also akin to trance, where the repetition is part of what it is. The fact that it's doing this like monotonously repetitive thing is not a failing. That's part of what makes it be what it is. So repetitiveness and the consistency of the repetitiveness is a pretty key factor to some kinds of music. Then you move on to structure, which is identifiable differentness with or without repetition. Structure is either like your techno going into a breakdown and all of the beat stuff stops and something else happens, or structure is a rock or pop song that is like verse, chorus, bridge, chorus out. And there can be very, you know, the structure of a pop song is about as rigid as the melodic, large-scale structure of a techno set that's really dance-oriented and just doesn't throw in key changes, just doesn't throw in like density changes. Some stuff like that is just going to remain locked in to the beat at all times and never let up. And a pop song on the different level of structure is going to remain locked into its verse chorus thing and never let up. And you're always going to know what it's going to do, which is kind of boring. Depends upon what you like. I tend to enjoy making the techno stuff, and I enjoy listening to stuff that's that sort of hypnotic, repetitive thing. But I don't seek out like rock and pop songs as much as maybe I should, because that's what I grew up on, you know. But then I grew up on like prog rock stuff, which violated those structures too. And ambient is not total freedom of structure. Ambient is a kind of structure. Because here, I go on from structure to say novelty, something different and not expected at any structure level. Novelty is doing something else. Novelty is breaking the thing. Like in ambient, if you have novelty, it's throwing a beat in there, or throwing an abrupt change in there if it's very legato and spacey, or throwing a change in depth if everything is very distant. It's novelty is changing the thing. And like I said, on any structure level, if it's not expected, I think I talked last week about Sinister Footwear 2 by Frank Zappa, and how you'd have this incredibly elaborately orchestrated thing going on, and it would work its way to the end. It's been blowing your mind the entire time. It comes to a halt, and then goes into truck driver divorce. It's very sad. And it's this dumb, fake country western song, because that's what Zappa did with novelty. Zappa knew how to do stuff with like Sinister Footwear, where it's throwing all this melodic and harmonic stuff at you, all this rhythmic stuff. Everything about it is like, I am melting your brain with all of my musical skills, and it's amazing. And you know, it's like Black Page type stuff practically. He's doing all of that. He's throwing in guitar solos. He's throwing in these unison passages, much like when I did the Evergreens and Apostrophe, lots of those. And how do you top that? Well, Zappa topped that by going for actual novelty and violating the structure so completely that finishing up this deeply serious, intense music, like, oh, that's so heavy, wow, that's amazing, he threw in something that completely clashes and contradicts with what he had previously been doing on purpose. That's novelty. And that's on a structure level that nobody was expecting, because the structure level of Sinister Footwear 2 is making the most imaginative outburst of creative instrumental noise, all in this deeply structured and disciplined way. And it's all very serious, and it's all very like, I am giving you the most brilliant musical experience. Again, how do you top that? How do you do novelty after you've done every possible brilliant, beautiful, amazing thing that you could? You do a really dumb country and western song that's intentionally cheesy. And that's literally what he did. Which brings us to predictability. Predictability is doing stuff that is expected on some structure level. Predictability is exactly what Zappa was not doing when he threw in Truck Driver Divorce after Sinister Footwear. It's this idea of doing things, whether they're novel or repetitive, that are expected. Yeah, you should totally check out Truck Driver Divorce. It's a fun song, and it's the dumbest sounding song you could imagine. It's one of those ones that he's making it so dumb on purpose. But predictability is actually really important, because when you're doing a structure level, when it's not just complete vagueness and lack of structure, lack of form, like even when you're doing that, like Elohim was talking about ambient, and is a big fan of ambient. And if you're doing a lot of that, you're doing a predictability thing. Because the sounds that you're making are meant to fit into a category. It's, there's not going to suddenly be a country western song in the middle of your ambient. If there was, you might get mad. Or if it suddenly became dubstep, you'd go, stop doing that. That's not what I was trying to listen to. Predictability. It's the same thing with my work on the synthesizers and generating chords and doing the chord organ stuff, which there's probably still things that I could try to do with all of that. In that, what I'm trying to do is generate stuff that has novelty and yet predictability. And, and that's why when I'm doing this work with the, I could grab this. Give me a second while I lean over this way and grab a thing. Excuse me. I whipped this out all over the place. This is the chord chart, and on the back I made notes for myself about if you were starting at a given note, which of these black keys starts getting brought into the thing. And the way that the chord chart works is, if you're moving around the circle of fifths, it makes small changes in a predictable way. It's adding this black key, and then it's adding that black key. You'll notice that they're both in the beginning of the black keys, and then it's adding the next one, and it's adding the next one. Again, it's in the same pattern, and so on and so forth. You start bringing in the other black keys, and if you go the other direction, you're starting to introduce the black keys from the other side of those little clusters of black keys. If you're moving within the circle of fifths, there is a predictability to the new notes that are being introduced. And that means if you're jamming along with it, and the keys that you're playing in are consistent, then it gives the capacity for novelty, and a chord that not only wasn't expected, but doesn't fit within the key that you're in, while yet having some predictability. And by that I mean, if you've got the circles of fifths going on, and you're doing the chords within this key, and you're in the key of C, and then suddenly you threw in something that comes from the key of G, well, there's going to be a new note in there that didn't belong with any of the key of C. But when the new note comes in, and you're in the key of G instead, all the other notes are still consistent, so there's still a predictability. You're just changing things slightly. There's enough novelty. Whereas if you were in the key of C, and you suddenly jump to the key of F sharp, which I think is, yeah, that's how that would work. That's how I've labeled it. All of a sudden you run all of the black keys, you've got barely any white keys, and you switch to that, and you've got novelty all right, but you've got no reference point. And it's literally as unpredictable as it can get. None of the notes you're working with will actually be familiar anymore. You've done like a truck driver divorce shift as far as harmonic tonality is concerned, and everything is now different. So I'm going to move on from talking about predictability, because I think I explained how on some structure level, predictability means you can guess what's going to happen and not be too far wrong. The next thing I put in is hooky/earwormy, and I'm going to define that as a distinct specific thing that will come back. A hook is something that you hear. It could be, a melody or a vocal riff. It could be a guitar riff quite easily. Guitar riffs are very much kind of hooky things. Or it can be a noise, a sound. Like I'm thinking of the Yes song, Owner of a Lonely Heart, where you've got that little break. It only happens once, but it's still a hook. Because if you listen to the song again, you go, oh, there's that thing. Boom, 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 and it gets into the guitar solo. That whole combination of sounds counts as a hook. Because it was striking enough, it was predictable, it did a repeating thing a couple of times, and then it continued with the chord that it hit with. You're used to hearing that, so it's like there's a predictability there. It's not doing a completely different chord. It's hitting the chord, and then it's going dun, 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 dun. That's a regular beat, so that's repeating. That's the chord sound that you were hearing before, and it's bridging from one thing to dun, 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 guitar solo, which is also a very hooky guitar solo because that's this little harmonizer sound that was very popular, to the point where people start putting that into presets and calling it Trevor Rabin, and he's like, how did I get known for just only this sound? That's insane. I would only use that sound once. I did only use that sound once, and now everybody is like, oh, that's the Trevor Rabin. And all of that is a hook. All of it is a hook. Much like, I'm trying to think of the specifics. There is the Steely Dan song Peg. Has some great guitar hooks in its solo section, because that's the song where it's a Steely Dan song, so it has really complicated harmonic constraints and stuff. All that's really, there's a lot going on there. And they wrote it up, and they had this guitar solo section where it went to a series of chords that there's a series of guitar players that tried to play leads over it, and they just sucked. In the review of Asia, in the classic albums DVD on that, it's talked about. And they played a few of the people's haphazard solos, including, I think, Walter Becker's, and they'd all failed. They tried to not get too heavy into demonstrating how bad everything was, but they were like, yeah, this is terrible. This is the worst. And it was like, and they were trying to play around these chords. They knew what the chords were, but it was lame. They were not getting what they wanted, and they kept trying new guitar players, and they brought in Jay Wawa Graydon, and he came in and laid down a solo in like one take. I think maybe it was one take, maybe it was more than one take, but in any case, he immediately nailed it and did completely unlike all the other people. And what he did was got a slide, and they're going, I seen your picture. They go into the solo. The music is basically the same as this entirely other feel. And he's like, he's doing these solos, and they're just very smooth and legato, and he's playing these notes that just take it into a different place. And that made it be a distinct thing rather than just emerging out of the notes that were already being played. Because that was the problem with the previous guitar players with making a hook, an earworm out of Peg, is they could hear what the background music was doing, and they were trying to do more of the same. They weren't doing a distinct, specific thing that'll come back on you. And Jay Graydon, playing the solo for that, grabbed a slide and started doing this very laid-back sort of Hawaiian guitar thing, a slide guitar thing. That, and he did jump into faster notes after that, but he was doing something where it was not the same as the feel of the background music that was going on. because it's a very funky, sort of bubbly little sound, all just little boppity notes going on. And if you just throw a envelope follower and exacerbate that going on, then you're not contrasting with anything. You're not contrasting with what's already happening. People were trying so hard to follow the chords that were being played that they just did more basically background instruments. And it needed Jay Graydon to come in and lay down a solo that was like, I'm going to spread some noise across all of this and then bring it in. So that's the idea of hooky and earwormy. I think that the idea of a distinct and specific thing is very key, because if your would-be hook is not distinct, it's nothing. And if your would-be hook is not specific, contained within a narrow little area, like, and the solo one peg is much like that, because he's going doo, and that's a very legato thing, and then he follows it up with even more of the same, kind of like the Owner of a Lonely Heart, where you've got this chord coming in. It's a sampler chord from a James Brown album or something, like doom, and then it continues with more of the same, dun 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 dun. This is how the hooks are made, by establishing the distinct thing and then developing on it in that specific way, perhaps repeating it, but at least nailing it down so it's within a particular time and space. It's a unit of something that's not the same as just more of whatever is behind it. And this is why it can be useful to do, like if you're doing ambient or something like that, because I know Elohim is really interested in that, and I'd like to continue filling that in some of the time. I do a lot of that stuff with my reverbs, so I like throwing that in. But that's why if I have a lot of beat things happening, I might really want to take some kind of instrument and just plunk something in deep reverb so it's just a wash, and have it come in there, but hopefully in such a way where it's distinct rather than just more development of the same. Or if you've got a ambient thing, set up a little sequencer, and all of a sudden you've got a xylophone on top of it for no particular reason, or a marimba. All of a sudden, instead of just you're like, and something just comes in that is a distinct, repeating little element, hopefully that's still in the genre. Like, you don't necessarily want to be like, this is a really good saxophone solo. Instead, it's like something that'll fit. I've heard some really cool ambient stuff where just electric instrument noises came in. And I'll point to like my Farfisa, which I want to bring back into this the roll of things. I'm not sure if you can actually see it. Maybe you can. Probably can. Because that is my favorite instrument for being able to hit a note and make these little beeps that just sound like, if you're in a space station's medical bay or something, and one of the doctor instruments went bip or something, that does the best bips of anything ever, because you just set it up with a tone or whatever. You're hitting the key and you're closing an electrical contact on a really, really primitive, old school waveform generator. They're all based off of the top octave divider chip. So all of the notes that you get are like slightly off of equal temperament. They're as close as they can get, but since they're being done by a top octave divider, they're just approximations. All of the notes are not quite perfect. And even from the lead sound that it has built into it, because it has a lead in there, which is pretty cool. The lead sound has a really slow attack most of the time, but then it transitions between, because it's a monophonic lead, it transitions between notes with a uncanny instantness, to the point where you can do like R2-D2 style things out of it, which I've done before. I've tried to do sound effects for game projects that involved taking the Farfisa, setting it to the lead voice and being like, stuff like that, just dwiddling it around, knowing that it's going to have that kind of really raw classic sci-fi sound to it. And that's something that you can stick into deep ambient and be a kind of hook, be a kind of thing where it's like, this is totally not in the fabric of everything else that I'm doing. But if I choose to do it rightly, I can play a couple of notes on that and it'll come off as cool. It'll feel right, rather than feeling like you just started playing a country western song in the middle of the ambient piece. Like, Zappa can do that, but he did that on purpose by doing the opposite in Sinister Footwear and leaving it like, what can he possibly do after that? And then that is his joke answer, is the country and western song. Now, at this point, I'm going to move on from the topic of hooky, although anybody wants to bring that back up, I'll be more than happy to talk more about any of these things, to immersive. And I'm calling immersive the ability for a listener to communicate with music on some level, which is a very general concept. But what I find about that is that when I'm doing music, one of the things I struggle with sometimes is being able to do stuff that people would want to listen to. And it's different all the time, because if I listen to stuff, I'm not necessarily going and listening to pop hits or well-constructed rock songs or anything like that. Maybe sometimes I am. And a fair amount of the time, I'm going for like your techno, or I'm going for your EDM. I'm going for something that's very repetitive, and it's baffling sometimes with me as far as like, why do I like this thing some days or maybe not other days? What is it about this particular thing that is going to really connect with me sometimes, or maybe not other times? And that's part of why I'm digging into all of this, trying to analyze this stuff. So, and Bo is bringing up pop hooks again, that one of the things about that is a hook is likely to be bait for you to be able to connect with in some way. Like, you mentioned Beatles hooks. EDM hooks are completely different. They're textural more likely than anything else. But as far as songwriting hooks, what you can do is throw out some distinct thing, or, you know, a hook could be a key change, or a funny note in the chords, or a funny note in the melody that's represented by stuff in there. A hook is anything that is a little bit distinct or different, and in that, I think it's helped by the fact that the personalities of the Beatles, John Lennon loved to throw in just violate norms. He wanted to sort of goon show, like, break your mind a little bit, do something that you didn't expect or that you didn't see coming, and he was so fond of that. He had this rebellious thing going on. And George Harrison also had his own style of rebellious thing going on as well, and liked to search for influences in places like Indian music that did not, like, that counts as a hook too. Harrison bringing some of those Indian influences in there. One did not do that as a British pop musician at the time, but they were able to come up with distinct, specific things that were defined clearly enough that you remember them. And very good question, Ahmed. The intro of Jump to Van Halen absolutely is a hook for several reasons. One of them is it's not a guitar. Like, that's Eddie Van Halen playing a keyboard. It's a guitar-driven band. Part of the reason that's a hook is it's a distinct thing. If he played it on guitar, that wouldn't be nearly as much of a distinct thing. For Van Halen, that becomes a distinct thing in the song. They didn't sit around doing, I mean, especially at the time, they didn't sit around doing keyboard-driven songs. Like, Eddie could play keyboards, but they were defined as a guitar-driven, a guitar hero band. So the whole concept of that intro being a hook is super relevant, especially because it was Van Halen doing it. If it was like Journey doing it, not nearly as much of a hook. Yeah, and I believe, Stephen, I know that album well enough, although it's really been too long since I listened to any of it. The fact that they have this long keyboard intro, you're right in that's not a hook, because it's too stretched out and it's kind of part of the same thing, and I think it is too. I'm not positive. But that intro is like them doing the Steve Miller Band Fly Like an Eagle thing. Of just like, okay, let's bring some space in here and let's get this revving up, and here we have, because I just feel like doing it. It's more of a conceptual hook, and it's not even so much a conceptual hook, but it's a conceptual novelty. It's not unique though, because on Fair Warning, there's that track, I think Sunday Afternoon in the Park, where Eddie ran a cheesy little synthesizer into his Marshall stacks for another interesting kind of novelty, which is like this roaring giant synth sound that's basically a really crappy little synth sound being trashed through huge amplifiers. And it was, again, a novelty, but it wasn't as much of a hook because it was just playing all kinds of stuff and kind of jamming rather than playing a specific thing. And that was all the track was. If it was something else going on, and then all of a sudden you cut into that, that would count as a hook, because it would be distinct enough. Instead, the Fair Warning use of synthesizers into a Marshall stack doesn't count as a hook, but it does count as a novelty, because it's not distinct and specific enough. It just keeps going. He's like, let's jam on this for a while. Do this and that and the other thing. Not enough repetition, and not enough like earworminess, not enough structure. That's an unstructured track. And by contrast, the intro 1984 to Jump is more structured, because it's consistently building a thing, and it builds and it ebbs away while remaining very much the same kind of thing, and then goes to the intro to Jump, which is the actual hook, because it's part of the actual pop song. So yeah. Now I'm going to jump into some of these detail things that I also wrote, and then we can go back to talking about other stuff too. Like I said, immersive ability for the listener to connect with music on some level. I'm going to call timbre detail brightness and compression and polytimbral contrasts. I talked about styles of modular synthesis, and one of the things that I called that stuff lacquerhead, because in the coming up with examples of how people do synthesis, one of the options is to do this sort of Autechre thing where you're just throwing so much sonic information at people, and it's really bright and it's really compressed and a lot is going on. So timbre detail is throwing a lot of information. It's pretty much literally this stuff where if you had to compress it to M3s, this is the stuff that would die fastest. Timbre detail is like playing on a cymbal and hearing all the special little shimmeriness of it, and hearing the person playing that shimmeriness in different ways, like different ways of striking it, scraping across it, just different stuff is constantly coming out, and it's all very bright and it's all very detailed, and there's a lot going on. By contrast, you throw a sine wave, that's not timbre detail. That is a thing happening, but it's a very simple sound. Or like some bass guitars, like they've got a Fender Mustang, it's a reissue, that is capable of doing an interesting timbre, but it's not a very detailed timbre compared to like the Rec or compared to dubstep-y type sounds. You're going to have a lot more highs and mid-ranges and stuff going on, and like a violin is very detailed timbre. Melody detail would be speed and complexity of notes. Again, detail is kind of more of how much of this can you have, and you'll get into problems of overly predictable, overly dense, overly fatiguing if you have too much detail everywhere. So melody detail is going to be speed and complexity of notes. It's having lots of stuff going on, and it can be very predictable, or it can be very unpredictable. Like if you're doing a guitar solo, you can just shred. You can play like 64th notes or 32nd notes and just continually do that, and that is it's structured. And it's kind of interesting and kind of not, because it can be too predictable. If all the notes are 30-second notes, there's a limit to how detailed that's going to feel, because you can hear the repetitiveness of it just hammering away. By contrast, you've got less disciplined guitar players like Jimmy Page. And there are times in solos where Jimmy Page would be doing something, he would be leaving space because he's good at that, and then all of a sudden, like, and there would be this outburst of notes that would just spatter across the sound, and Jimmy Page would be using things like, Telecaster and relatively undistorted guitar sounds compared to what people use these days. And in so doing, you wind up with a little spatter of notes that are very clearly articulated. And that is a very detailed burst of melody, pretty much just all of a sudden. And not necessarily even snap to the grid either. Because when you do a burst of notes like that, often it could be just a kind of an abstract spattering of something. And there's a lot of coolness, I find, to that. That's something that I find very appealing. To the extent that when I'm playing guitar, I will often be trying to do stuff like that. I'm not pretty much ever seeking to just hammer out a continuing and very tight sequence of 30-second notes or anything like that. By contrast, when you're talking about melody detail, speed and complexity of notes in a guitar solo, and it's not an abstract spattering, but it is a very structured thing, Eruption. Eddie Van Halen doing his finger tapping thing, which is a crowd pleaser every time. And he'd be doing this various riffs and jams and things, and all of a sudden it's just this pattern. And the pattern is intensely tight and rigid. It's like a machine. And then he's progressing it, because there's more structure to even that. It's not just sitting on the one thing. It's shifting, and then shifting some more. If you've learned to play it on guitar, then you know that you have to go up a little bit, and then your other notes have to go up a little bit, and then so on and so forth. And by the time you reach the high part, you're doing this like shifting down. There's a whole sequence in there where it's following a really well-written structure, and the repetitiveness of the notes are completely fixed. It's really fast, but it never wavers. That's another kind of melody detail. That's another kind of being able to throw a lot of notes on there, but then rather than having them just be a abstract emotive burst, you're forming an entire structure, you're forming an entire pattern and sticking rigidly to that. The letter J is in my name. I'm Chris Johnson. So Ahmed was just rising off harmonic detail. So this is another thing. Harmonic detail is departure from a harmonic center and probably involves implying a root note or key. So we'll get back to this chart. Someday I have to scan this in and let people download it, because I put a lot of effort into drawing this up so that I could refer to it. Harmonic detail is this kind of stuff, where if you're just sticking within a tightly enclosed section, like 4-chord song is this little diamond shape here. C, G, A minor, F, C, G, A minor, F forever. If you stick within a tightly enclosed section, the harmonic detail is not going to be all that great. You're not bringing a lot of the black keys, you're not bringing a lot of different things in. Whereas the contrast to that would be something like giant steps. Giant steps might be the biggest example of harmonic detail anybody ever did, because what giant steps does is it jumps among a triangular section of things in 6 chords, is essentially the guts of it, where it's not just randomly bouncing around. What makes it so fascinating as far as harmonic detail and a departure from a harmonic center is it's going literally as far as you can in a 3-stage move, like all the way over to here and then all the way over to here. And it's following a sequence of chords where the 6 chords are related, they're next to each other. And they're resolving in the way that chords can resolve by going clockwise around this circle. It goes resolve to this, jump over to here, resolve to this, jump over to here, resolve to this. So it's a really tightly organized pattern harmonically, while simultaneously being the biggest departure from the harmonic center that you could possibly have. So it's implying root notes by consistently returning to the root note, but the pattern that it's making, although it's predictable, is really hard to comprehend. So the departure from harmonic center has a lot to do with your circle of fifths here. I'm not really sure what negative harmony is, Ahmed. You can say more about that and I'll riff off of it. Conceptual detail is where I would go back to, like Sinister Footwear going into Truck Driver Divorce. How predictable is the work as a whole? How specific is the genre? And this is something that can easily happen with EDM. This is something that can easily happen with ambient. So a lot of stuff. This is something that can easily happen with pop or rock music. If the thing that you make is just so genre bound that it can't possibly violate anything, that's low conceptual detail. That is being really hobbled by what your expectations are. It's like, well, I got to do 4/4 because this is always in 4/4, and I got to do these filter sweeps because you always do filter sweeps, and I got to do this or that or the other thing. Or if you're an ambient, it's like, well, I got to have reverb. Well, maybe you don't. Maybe you don't got to have reverb. But the predictability, and remember, predictability is another concept. It's expected in some structure level. So complete unpredictability is what I described as lacquerhead style modular music, where it's like huffing a lot of glue or something, and your brain's just exploding, and it's this burst of colors and lights. It doesn't hang together. There are no hooks. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't take you anywhere. All you've done is just burn your brain for a while. So overmuch conceptual detail can be exhausting. Overmuch conceptual detail in the wrong places is negative. You want to have some predictability. It's just a question of, how genre bound do you intend to be? Do you intend to violate all the genres? Well, then you're probably just making noise, and even people who like noise will possibly be either tired of you or insulted by something that you did. Much like the way that people could have the Zappa album Them or Us and always take the needle off before Truck Driver Divorce because they're like, okay, I get that this is funny, but still it's pissing me off. And then lastly, conceptual focus, which is kind of a similar concept. Given a thing, how rigidly are you sticking to that thing? And that's a pretty key question to ask, because it's not a given that you must stick to the thing. Like, I think it's very easy for people, especially if they learn stuff from elsewhere, like my brother with his programming and stuff, learns the expectations and genres of how code is made, but then sticks to it very rigidly. And I've been showing him to be different. I've been showing him ways of being different, and he's taken on to that to some extent. But by the same token, and this is a problem that I've run into sometimes. I got David Pixley in the chat, and he's run into that sometimes as well, maybe. Or maybe not. It's hard to tell, because in some ways I feel like I don't hear you playing many country and western songs, dude. There's a whole conceptual level where you could be violating the expectations. If you're just sticking to a level of atonal noise, you could be, if you've got a beat, maybe you're doing Berlin techno. If you've got, like, you can't make any notes, everything has to be not a note, well, that is also a very limiting factor. So it's like, how rigidly are you sticking to that thing? Knowing that if you're going to be recognizable, if you're going to be hooky and have your own style in any sense, that is sticking to some kind of genre, sticking to some kind of predictability. Because if everything is different, then it's like nothing is different. And if everything is abstract noise, that's actually fairly limited. You're not playing any country western songs. You're not playing any really worked out structural things that are super composed. And Chopin made his whole career based on negative harmony? Okay, fair enough. Sounds like you're talking about modality. That's cool. I suppose I could look that up. That might be interesting. But yeah, and Charlie, hey, have I heard Wolfpack? No, but I suppose I might at some point. See, here's the thing, and I see David going, I don't like genres or grouping things in general. I feel you. That same desire has led me to grief sometimes, and because it's hard to sort out. Oh, no, I have not tried. I'm happy that somebody is making a plugin based on my stuff. My stuff is open source for a reason. So, very cool. But what I've been doing with my music stuff is figuring out which kinds of things cause me to do more music and which kinds of things cause me to just stop. Because there have been times that I started trying to get myself to do kinds of music, including stuff that I play. Like, I played stuff on the API Calypse thing that people don't hear every day from me. It's a slightly different track than I come up with. And the thing about that is that was in an area where I was getting experimental in such a way that it was taking me away from what I liked. And I've done that a number of occasions, and sometimes that leads to me stopping playing music for years. So I care very deeply about understanding this about myself, about understanding this music experience modality that I've made all these notes about. In doing this, I'm trying to figure out what I want to be doing as a musical entity. And some of the stuff that I've settled upon is that I tend to do more music when I am improvising. I am not inherently a composer. I'm a reactor. What I'd ideally like to do is be in a situation where, in a genre that I'm enjoying, in a genre where I feel like there is enough structure that I can add something to it, I can get a system going, much like the chord progressions that I programmed into my stuff, that I can add something to, or that can lead me somewhere interesting. And then what I'm going to want to do is get into this tapestry of sound and start collaborating with guiding it. I'm not necessarily going to want to be like, and here is where I play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Or I sat down and I wrote all of this stuff out and now we're just playing it back. For me, the interacting has a lot to do with what I like about music and what I like about sound. Always was. I've always had the tendency of like picking up a guitar and just starting to play leads and things. Just making these little melodies. Hopefully they're kind of hooky. Hopefully they're melodies that I find interesting. They're typically not super duper structured in the sense of I'm not going to start writing something like Eruption and then practicing it. But I'm going to want to be in a situation where I'm doing that and I'm listening to what's around me and responding to it. Those are the times that I enjoy. Like when I went to the second Saturday Synthfest, which was the time that I got really sick. This is before I got really sick. One of the things I liked about it was a guy let me play his synthesizer. The organizer let me play his synthesizer. He was awesome. And I was able to listen for notes that were happening in this dense pile of like 5 synthesizer players all piped through the same PA. Most of them can't hear themselves, so it just gets loud because people try to turn up until they can hear what they're doing. Or it just gets muddled because people are playing things that don't really fit, but they can't hear what they're doing and they're just doing the best that they can. What I liked about that situation was I could listen in to try to hear the notes in there that needed reinforcing. And then I sort of patiently, like if I couldn't hear myself, I'd like try to pick a different sound. I didn't really know the instrument very well. I couldn't find that much about it. But I was able to find high notes. I was able to find certain sounds that were okay with me. And so I would find a sound until I could hear, like, I just played that note. That note is me playing. And then I would find the bit in there and go, now let's find the note that somebody else is playing and play something off of that. Or the guy whose synth it was moved away from the mixing board where he was trying to balance everybody on the fly. And he started throwing this little rhythmic thing in there. So I was like, oh, cool, he's right next to me and he's doing a thing and I see him doing it. Therefore, I'm going to play the notes along with that and I'm going to follow his rhythm. Let's do a little jam. Let's throw that in. And we had great fun doing that. He did it a little bit and then he stopped because it was more of a hook rather than we're going to do this for the rest of the jam. And that's what I live for. That's what I like. I was fully alive when I was listening in this whole thing. I'm looking at all the different people who have different levels of deer in the headlights look, and I was looking out upon them like, oh yeah, this is my jam. I'm listening to all you people, and I dare you to throw in something weird at me because I'll hear it and I'll come up with something useful around it. And it's all part of this big tapestry of sound which could go anywhere. Somebody could throw something textural. I'll be like, I am down with the conceptual focus of suddenly we're playing something that's more rhythmic, or suddenly we're all super ambient, or suddenly, high frequencies, suddenly low frequencies. I'm down with listening for that as well, not just the note, and doing stuff that will work with whatever we've just changed the music to. And that's where I sit in the same area as David Pixley there, because what you're really shooting for is that. When you do the thing of like, I don't want any noise, I don't want any genres, I don't want any of that stuff, let's just plug everything into everything else and truly have creativity. You're basically looking for that. You're not really looking for necessarily even the sound that you're making. You're looking for the concept of whatever this is, it could be different. It could be something totally different. And the ability that you're able to do it is going to be the ability, the extent to which you can identify structure and move in the direction of it temporarily. Because I feel this is a possible fatal flaw with many of these things. If you're only looking for clashing with what seems to be happening because, woo, different man, then that is a handicap because that leads the collective away from structure that becomes hooky/earwormy, that becomes a distinct specific thing that's recognizable. You lose the recognizability when stuff is too spaced out. And you lose the ability to improvise and have novelty if stuff's not spaced out enough. So yeah, and people are talking a lot about Chopin and stuff like that. I'm going to have to look up negative harmony, but it might not actually do me much good because the thing is, like, I'm working on my own theory with this stuff. Like, what I'm trying to do here is come up with ways where I can get systems to throw kinds of, like, I have not yet set up a thing where the synthesizers are playing like a square wave or whatever, and we're transposing between here and here in a regular way. If I was transposing between here and here in a regular way, and I was good enough at identifying, like, this is where this sits in the guitar, this is where this sits in the guitar, this is coming up, I'm going to be moving over to these notes, so let's throw a bunch of notes and then abruptly transition to these just when the structure did. That stuff I love, but I have not taken it to that level yet. I've got stuff still just kind of wandering around in an area, hopefully, that I can recognize, and I'm still learning what I can do regarding these tools, regarding this way of being able to throw harmonic development in there. And again, the fun part is that I can be playing in any number of modes in all these harmonic centers. I could be playing more minor or major. It's easier to hear stuff like majorality. But if stuff is floating around like seventh chords and it's just playing these ones and it's not playing the major chords, it's going to need to lead me into a Mixolydian mode to follow that. And then if I've got a little cluster there, all of a sudden I'm playing in a mode and it's sounding absolutely awesome. And it's fairly easy to identify, like, the modes are just different tonal centers of the same key. So it's not that hard to do that. What's harder is being able to hear, oh, I'm in Phrygian. Let's emphasize the root, let's emphasize the minor second, because we're in Phrygian. We need to sound kind of ominous in Metallica or Spanish or something like that. And those are the challenging things. And if I just started throwing random notes about, I'd lose that. I'd lose the structural quality of what I was trying to do. Cool conversation. What I'm talking about here, this absolutely is a 12-tone system because it includes every possible toner center. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, literally. So the thing is, you don't use all of these at once. When you say 12-tone system, what you're talking about is an abstraction done by Schoenberg, where 12-tone means here is all of your possible notes. You must use one of each before you can start repeating them. That would be a 12-tone row. That's a kind of discipline that Schoenberg was getting into, where rather than leaving off the black notes or leaving off different things that weren't part of the key, it's like, okay, we need to start composing in such a way where I have a melody or I have something like that, which is literally using all of these notes in the 12-tone system and going from there. So 12-tone system usually means those tone rows. 12-tone system usually means while you are making your music, it must include all of these notes at essentially the same time. And what I'm doing here is explicitly not a 12-tone system, because what I'm trying to do is establish emotively to people, oh, Kevin, what did I miss? Where is it? Dun, 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 dun. Is it still on the screen? If it's not on the screen, please bounce it. We've got a few minutes to get back into that. Which would be to say, repeat that. And yeah, Charlie, you're saying with the conversation analogy, here's the thing with this stuff. Like, also, I'm a big fan of, like, John Scofield's song Protocol, which is much like Giant Steps, but I don't know exactly how it's constructed. I should look it up sometime and find out. Because the thing about, when I say circle of fifths, and Ryan is like, it seems limiting unless you go within to expand, all that means is changing key to this key means that only one note in the scale changed. Absolutely, I will. And that's why fifths. It's not like your changes have to be fifths. They don't even have to be fifths. You could be like C, D7, E minor, F, and none of those are a change of a fifth. They're not adjacent to each other in this. But you're still staying within the circle of fifths, meaning that you've got a set of keys that are closely harmonically related. I'm going to take a moment and scan up and see whether I can see Kevin's question, because I'm running low on time and I should go and take my nap because I'm still trying to heal up. I don't see it. Okay, Kevin, you're going to have to ask me again. I'll stick around long enough to see it, but I can't see where you asked, so obviously I did not get your question. And yeah, this is in a big sense what we do, and the reason I'm digging into this modality so much is that we have a whole thing going on about, like, do we want to do genres? Do we want to do... Oh, yeah. That's a fair question. I'm glad that you brought it back up again, because I think I saw that going by. The proper way to use plugins like console, bus, and channel is, as long as your mix has a place in it where stuff is being summed at unity gain, you can just drop it in and it'll work. If stuff is not getting to any stage where the combining stage is at unity gain, then you got to do it in a more complicated way. The console system passes through audio unchanged if it's just one track out of a bunch at a time. And when multiple tracks start happening, if it's set up correctly, it'll give you the expanded space within the mix, as long as you're not distorting the overall system too much. And the gain staging is going to matter, but mostly as far as level tweaking is concerned, the thing that you got to remember is it really wants you to have a DAW where you could put it in post fader. It really wants you to be able to plug in the stuff as if you were programming the DAW yourself and literally replacing how volume levels go. So if you've got a mix where the faders are all at different levels because it's a mix, you can't just drop it into that. You have to drop it in a later stage. Oh no, encoding overloaded? Huh. Oh, we seem to still be streaming though, whatever. You have to manufacture a situation where you've got a place in the mix where the channel plugins go that are unity gain between that and the output of the mix bus. And you can construct a mix from scratch and just learn to do that, in which case you're doing all your gain staging before that final plugin if it doesn't let you put stuff post fader. But mostly the proper way to stick it on an old mix is if you were able to generate a situation where the stuff that you're feeding goes to a summing bus. It's as if you were going outboard. Think of it as if putting console in is like you were going outboard. You got to run out the outputs, and those outputs go into like the external summing bus thing, and then you get the inputs coming back off of that. And there aren't any controls on the external summing bus thing, so you're running all the outputs at whatever level is relevant. Because it's only a summing bus, it's not a mixer itself. Console is only a summing bus, it's not a mixer itself. So it's not for sticking in like gain trims between those and the output. And Stephen, that's also a really good question. We're kind of winding up, but that's also a really good question, because I can't guarantee that panning and pan laws always work out that well with console. What I can say is it's not going to be a wild, big, huge difference. It could change some of your interbalances there. So really what console is mostly about is like a dual mono situation where you've got unity gain going to a final summing bus, and if everything was already in stereo pairs, then it would work perfectly. And that's kind of how it works out in many ways, but if you've got pan laws that are changing gains, it's going to have small changes. What is affected by pan law doesn't count as big changes. And if you do have change happening in a console mix, it doesn't automatically break everything. All it does is if you've got stuff padded that's not supposed to be, those tracks will be more distorted than they're supposed to be. If you've got stuff boosted that's not supposed to be, those tracks will be more expandy, more spiky and transient than they're supposed to be. And that's all that's going to happen. It doesn't really kill or break anything. It's just changing the saturation levels of individual stuff that shouldn't necessarily be different. So yeah. And a last question by Charlie Hayden. Does the final output engine in the DAW affect the sound? Could you place a tape deck? Well, that's what I made tape for, although arguably it has too much bass. And I'm not really, because the thing is, I haven't done that much as far as mixing stuff from scratch into it. I designed it in such a way that you'd be able to construct stuff that had really emphatic and satisfying bass pretty much no matter what you started with. Like, you'd never need to be bass boosting things in the bass, and your overall mix would wind up with a lot of size and scope to it. But yeah, the final, you can definitely put a tape deck like to tape 6 or literally just tape, which is a very simple one, and put that in after like your console system or whatever, and then print the mix directly after that. If I was doing that, I would be mixing into it though. I always feel that everything regarding that, or everything like compression that's on a mix bus, you kind of need to be mixing into it. You kind of need to settle on a bus stage that is going to work for you, and then mix into that and make your decisions based on kind of the system that you're driving. Like, it's a musical instrument of its own right that you are playing by feeding it different sources of audio. And Stanstees is asking, is there plans for a refined Fathom 6? There's been a bunch of stuff like that, and that's one of the things that's on the agenda. I will likely have to come up with some kind of cool name. I'm thinking of the name Bass Control for just the final sum of all of that stuff. But Fathom 5 became like a bass kit and a variety of other stuff like that. And I've ended up with wanting to do stuff that is essentially a stereo plug, because bringing in that much deep bass hugeness, although I'm doing it on tape, frankly, you're better off generating that in mono, because speakers will just fight themselves if you're not generating it in mono. And so I've got stuff that brings in like a subsonic generator and a bottom octave, which is just essentially the same kind of thing as tape, but it's doing it in a mid-side format where the side is not getting a bunch of bass pumped into it. And the idea of the bass control thing is like, okay, combine that with 2 vinyls so that we can also put high passes on respectively the mid and the side as needed. Or just design something where it's like, this is only focused on doing the stuff that I consider important. And thus it'll cut this and it's kind of preset, and it'll cut that and it's kind of and that's the kind of thing that I did with tape, is trying to put stuff together that I feel is going to work in a context and that has less fiddly bits to get buried in. So I'm going to chase some of these final questions because I do intend to go and take a nap, but before then, this has been a really lively and chatty Q&A, which is cool. I feel like I'm back in the swing of things and stuff. I'm thinking a little more cleverly. Ahmed's asking, is Neverland and IPocalypse a direct model of those respective consoles? Nope. Oh, no. No. It's just an abstraction of different, typically preamplifier impulse response measurements. So what that stuff is, the early character and then also all the bus color stuff, is taking audio samples of the actual gear, but then reconstructing something based on the fact that I had access, and I should still have it if I dig for it. I don't know where I left it. I had access to nice high quality impulse responses going through gear at multiple levels. So I had the sound of, because a guy wanted somebody to do this. And so I did for them. But I had access to, like, this is an API pre, this is their impulse response running through the API pre at like minus 60 dB. This is them running through the API pre at plus 24 dB, and they're smashing the transformers like crazy. And which gave you basically just an impulse response. The harmonic content has been my problem. But all I'm doing is working with that base information to do something interesting and creative that seemed like it would be useful by dynamically creating a thing that uses both impulse responses, and it's not even loading them in as if they were directly there. I wrote code to kind of create something that was neither impulse response, that was a combination of them all. So yeah. Yep, they're not direct models. They're distinct sounds of their own. And that's one of the reasons I changed I walked away from names like Neverland and API Collabs and went to bus colors, because the idea is that it's a generic kind of color that's based off of a known source. And I've been taking it away from that source ever since. It needs to be like, this is the general concept of lush, deep, rich analog console. And if I can make it more like that, even if it's not consistent with what the real Neve is, I'll do it. I'll do it. So yeah. So let me keep an eye on, we got a lot of chat going on, and that makes me happy. You realize you can show up on Wednesday as well, and we're just hanging around and playing Minecraft. So you can get into wild conversations about things. You'll be hanging out with a number of people who are musicians, and so there's no reason we can't get dragged onto stuff. The thing with the Wednesday stream is that it's not work. It is not me like formally answering questions. It's me derping around and playing with some friends. And you are all my friends too, so you can come and join anytime you like. And as a last question and answer, what is next week's plugin? Digital Black. I'll give you Digital Black. I'm ready to do that one. Nicola's coming. Not next week, but it's coming. I'll get that. So yeah. And people clearly know what 12-tone rows are. And yep. And Oloheim is like, screw tones, just make sounds. Yep, that's Berlin techno for you, if you do a good enough beat with it. It would be worth getting back into 80 clip, I think. I agree with you, Kevin. It hasn't happened yet, but it's getting there. Hell yeah, you have a friend, Ahmed. Be careful though, because if my friends get stroppy, I will scold them. So my friends become better that way, because if they're being terrible in some kind of way, I'm like, I would rather you not be terrible. But we all like live and grow and stuff. And I would enjoy you guys visiting me on Wednesday. You don't have to if you don't want to, but that is something. Oh, Bo, Digital Black is my gate. It's not Softgate. Softgate is actually already out. Digital Black is a end-to-end gate, meaning that it's not stereo linked. And it is like what you'd use for a metal guitar or something, where if you're muting, it can really shut the heck up. And the way that works is it's a gate. It has a certain amount, like the speed with which it reacts is based on how much bass is going through it. So if it's bright sounds, it'll cut off faster. If it's bassy sounds, it'll cut off more gracefully. And as it cuts off, it goes through negative density calculations. So the sound, rather than simply being quiet, like goes away into silence. It goes back into silence. So basically, Digital Black is when you want a gate to sound and feel like a super gatey gate, and you want to make something be real staccato, it's a good choice for that. It's also got hysteresis, so it doesn't really sputter. In fact, it's very good at not sputtering. But it's coming next week. You can play with it then. Alrighty. And with that, I will call that day. And it's been fun chatting with you guys so much. I think it's partly because I just started digging into stuff. I had enough time, and also I got sick, so I had time to focus on other things. And that gave me the ability to think about stuff that wasn't literally just only plugins. So you get stuff like this. You get like talking about the modality of different kinds of music experience, and I find that very interesting, and it also teaches me what kinds of music I make that I'm enjoying, and what kinds of music I make because I feel that I ought to, or that it's popular or something like that, where just my interest goes away and I stop making. So these are all important things. In any case, I will talk to you later. Let's see where we got there. Yep. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.